Good morning. I am Bud Cramer, naturally from the South. Nicknamed Bud, really Robert Cramer Jr. Bud was a way of sort of separating my identity from my father, because I was junior and he was senior. From Huntsville, Alabama. And I was a young prosecutor, actually a young assistant prosecutor in my what would become my district attorney's office, which I still claim, best job I ever had, as Michael said. Was assigned to juvenile court to work with, occasionally, social workers. The most dreaded assignment in the district attorney's office at that time. There I would go to court every day, this revved up, energetic lawyer who wanted everybody to like him and was very insecure about the court process because law school didn't prepare me to do that. And I was meddling with families, juvenile justice cases, but particularly with the social workers who were challenged to offer the court information and proof that a child should be removed from custody of their parents, either temporarily or maybe even permanently, which I thought was awesome, meaning incredibly challenging. And one of the most dedicated set of folks I ever got to work with were those social workers who were charged with doing that. And I wanted to be an effective partner with them. So I make you hear that to let you know that I got introduced, almost accidentally, to family dysfunction issues, social workers doing their noble work, as a young prosecutor who wouldn't admit it, but eventually enjoyed that job very, very much. And that's tough to say even to this audience today. Flash forward. I became district attorney. I got elected at a very young age. Very young age. One of my goals, just thought through me to me, was, look, I want prosecutors that want to do this work. We had a kid that was killed, and I felt like the kid's parents killed the kid. And I sat through, I was too young at the time as an assistant prosecutor to be involved in the trial of that case, but I sat through that trial and I kept thinking, we could have protected that kid. We could. Neighbors complained this kid was treated horribly and differently than the other siblings in the family. But what could we have done differently? So I sort of brought that forward when I became district attorney. And I set up these weekly meetings with the social workers and took prosecutors down into those meetings. And that was in the early 80s. I hate to give dates over this because it seems to go back so far. But in the early 80s, we knew very little about child sexual abuse. I knew a lot about child physical abuse and family dysfunction, but remarkably very little about child sexual abuse. So we started talking, unfortunately, about child sexual abuse and issues that were coming out of families. And I said, wait a minute. I had a 12-year-old girl I took into the courtroom, and I handled that interview process. I handled that process terribly. I took the case into the courtroom myself. My judge was one of my worst enemies in the courtroom. He really did not want me prosecuting this case. My own fellow lawyers in the district attorney's office said to me, you're really going to believe, you're really going to present information based on the testimony of a 12-year-old girl who was accompanied by her grandmother, who eventually had to say to me, Mr. Cramer, slow down here. You are the 8th individual who's interviewed my granddaughter. You're taking her before the grand jury. You got to tell us what all this means and what's down the road here, because let's use the name. Tina is not going to talk about this anymore. She is shut down on me. And sure enough, Tina wouldn't talk to me. I knew I needed help. I knew I needed not just my social worker friends that were still around at that time that were partnering with me. Damn good relationship with law enforcement. I had my law enforcement detectives for the most part participating with me, though I had some municipalities that were not eager to participate at all. I wanted a house. I wanted a one-stop service center. I wanted to do things differently than we were doing it. I came to D.C., Washington, D.C., as a prosecutor, reached out to my National District Attorneys Association, the National Association of Social Workers, relevant national organizations, to find out maybe what was going on around the country that I could learn from. Another center, another community, of course, struggling with this issue as well. What do we do with these cases? How do we handle them? How do we interview? Do we record? How do we interview a 7-year-old, much less an 11-year-old, an 11-year-old boy differently than an 11-year-old girl, a 14-year-old? All of these issues were overwhelming. We set up a task force in our community, and actually we used, let's still say, Tina's case We kind of used that as a community example of how we had handled it. How did I become interviewer number 8? How timelines, how far down from first disclosure at a hospital, which this one was, to when in the courthouse in downtown Huntsville, not a big city, nonetheless, downtown, rather grim building in downtown Huntsville, Alabama. I was tucked away on the 4th floor where the grand jury would meet as well. How far down the disclosure line was I? And then eventually we took this case to court, and we wanted to look at those timelines and to learn from that. And then I remember, it's interesting to look up at the logo here at Children's Cove. I found a house in Huntsville near the courthouse, and I had a little money in an account that I had discretion to use. And I rented that house, and I said, we are going to interview kids here. And kind of up here I was saying, we are going to interview kids here, aren't we? We're going to start this program, and we will use it. By that time, Child Protective Services regional folks were kind of coming in to find out what this district attorney was doing with the Child Protective Service workers, trying to turn them into investigators, trying to turn them into partners with law enforcement. They weren't so sure that that was a role they wanted their Child Protective Service workers to play there. So I present those kind of early issues. We set up a regional training program there. We announced that we were going to locate our Children's Advocacy Center in this house near downtown Huntsville. I told my own lawyers, you will go down there, you will work, you will discuss these cases, you will go to team meetings. We will work more effectively together, so if another 12-year-old comes through the system with a grandmother, she feels a little bit better about what we're doing together there. So we started our center, and then we faced other turf issues as well. But I want to bring this forward. When Mary LeClaire, Mary, are you still in the room back there? Mary, you know from coming to Huntsville that we started we now call it a symposium. 28 years, we've had anywhere from 800 or 900 folks to 1,500 or so folks come to Huntsville to participate in training there. This started as an idea we had in the district attorney's office to make sure that some of us knew a little bit more about how to interview kids, how to handle prosecutions, how to coordinate the investigations, how the medical exams were done, where they were done, who was participating in those medical exams, because it was a dream of ours to have those medical exams done in our center, though we didn't quite have room for it. So we invited other communities, like your community, to come in and tell us what your history was with issues like we were facing. And so Mary LeClaire comes to Huntsville, and she starts talking about what you're doing here, the early days of what you're doing here. Because we always felt like, look, we're in Huntsville, Alabama. We're a community of maybe 200,000 folks concentrated in one county. What are they doing in Miami? What are they doing in Philadelphia? What are they doing in Grants Pass, Oregon? What are they doing on Cape Cod? What are they doing in other communities around this country? And so we learned from one another. And that training program grew into a symposium, and we have learned marvelously together. And so what started with 4 or 5 programs around Huntsville and in Alabama grew to 40, 50 around the country. Interestingly, Janet Wingo was state's attorney down in Miami before she would become attorney general. She had a daycare investigation that was very difficult for her prosecutors to be involved in. They wanted to come to Huntsville to talk about how they were interviewing children and how they were handling families whose children were abused. We began talking more about extended assessments. How much do children really disclose in that first interview versus the second versus the third? Who's doing that second interview? Where is it being done? Who's doing the third interview? How many of those interviews are occurring before the police are actually involved in them and before the prosecutor's office really knows? We were then more interested, as I said, in medical exams, in a mental health component. I took several cases to court, and court was over with, sometimes successful prosecution, sometimes not a successful prosecution. I remember one of the first cases I tried, and the jury quickly found the defendant not guilty. I couldn't believe it. I thought this was a slam dunk case. I looked at that 13-year-old girl and I thought, my God, I haven't prepared her. We haven't prepared her for the fact that a jury may say, in effect, we don't believe you. what kind of damage does that do? And how could we have handled getting her and her, some of her family that were in court with her? How could we get them ready for that possible outcome? So we had a lot to learn together. But it's the Mary LeClairs who were making things happen in their communities that would come in and share those kind of histories together. Michael, more power to you and what you're doing here in your job as district attorney. That job, looking back on it, is the best job I ever had. In my early days working with my professionals, as frustrating as it was, sometimes we had a police chief that was difficult, or a sheriff that was difficult, or a supervisor, a regional supervisor of CPS that was difficult. But we found a way to work around those folks and make sure that we got things done. Now, I got elected to Congress in 1990 after serving 10 years as district attorney. Open seat, my predecessor ran for governor, left the seat open. I had some personal issues. My wife had died, my daughter had gone off to college. My life was very different, and it seemed like this might fit me, so I ran for Congress. Open seat, 13, 14 other people running. Where I went in what would become my congressional district, people would say to me, I'm voting for you because of what you do, what you've done for kids. I didn't realize what kind of exposure I got. One media market out of Huntsville, Alabama, blast the TV media around what would become my congressional district. And we would talk from time to time carefully about what we were doing with our new Children's Advocacy Center, how we were working together. The symposium brought well-known folks to the community as well. The community liked that, so I got a lot of exposure. So there was political power in this issue. I got elected to Congress. I went up there. By that time, we had 60, 70 programs around the country. We had the symposium going. I wanted a national network. I wanted an organization, a membership organization of programs. I wanted certain standards so that the name couldn't just be used by anybody out there. And I wanted to know what components are involved in your program. The CPS, are you doing the medical exams? What are your protocols? We can bank that information. We can make communities that don't have such programs aware of that information, and we can offer these kind of services to communities around the country. So the first piece of legislation I wrote was called the National Children's Advocacy Protection Act. You know, we have to make it a mouthful, don't we, in that world? The National Children's Advocacy Protection Act. Remember, I had no background in the legislature. I was a prosecutor. I went to Washington, D.C., idealistic, still fairly young. Look what happens. My staff had to hand carry me through writing the piece of legislation. What do we do with it now? We had to get it authorized. We got it authorized. I thought I won the lottery. And I said, okay, where does the money come from? Well, that's the appropriations process. You have to start all over again in the appropriations process. So it made me learn what I'm now a veteran at. We got an appropriation within 2 years for $500,000 to start the National Network of Children's Advocacy Centers, located there in Washington, D.C., to hire staff that could profile programs that existed around the country, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, in the West, who's doing what, bank that information, offer it to other folks. The District of Columbia was working on their version of a Children's Advocacy Center, and it would take them forever to get that done. But I had an idea that maybe we could have a working Children's Advocacy Center in Washington, D.C., a resource center upstairs where the national network would be located. So if a group, real case, came in from Columbus, Ohio, and said, we want to see an existing Children's Advocacy Center, well, here it is. Here's D.C.'s Children's Advocacy Center. We want to go upstairs. We want to talk about what they're doing in Cleveland. We want to talk about what they're doing in St. Louis, or we want to talk about what they're doing in Denver. Here are the community information sheets there. We slowly but surely were able to get some of that done. Through this year, we've gotten millions and millions of dollars for programs around the country through that same umbrella legislation that we passed in the early 90s. We have 800-900 programs around the country. We have programs around the world. I am astonished at the work that you do. I am honored to be here before you and look out at you and know that you go to work every day trying to make this world, for those kids who've been abused, a better world under very difficult circumstances. That young girl, Tina, that I took into the courtroom with her grandmother and learned the hard way about what not to do. Tina's life was hell after we finished a successful prosecution. Her grandmother had to give her up. She couldn't handle her behavior problems. She ran away. She became a prostitute, a drug addict. She would resurface from time to time, and she would touch base with me. I took her through our Children's Advocacy Center house once with her grandmother, who would become a board member with us. And Tina, I said, Tina, as difficult as this might be for you to hear, your situation made us change the way we work. And this is how we work now. We didn't have a center like this. We didn't have interview protocols. We didn't do things then like we do things now. And we walked outside and we were chatting, and she said to me, Mr. Cramer, what took so long? This isn't that difficult. And it really isn't that difficult as a concept to do. In reality, it is very, very difficult, and you are doing that work, and I congratulate you. Now, in Washington, where I now work 4 days a week, I would go back to Alabama still every week. I left that job voluntarily, by the way. In that arena, sometimes you don't leave voluntarily. And there was a lot of partisanship when I was there. I happened to be a Democrat from the South, and that would become a very difficult job to hold, being a Democrat from the South. Conservative Democrat from the South, a blue dog Democrat from the South. It seemed like no party wanted me. I was too conservative for the Democrats, and yet I was a Democrat, but I had friends on both sides of the aisle, because for me to get my legislation passed, I needed for Kay Granger from Dallas, Texas, an appropriator who would become a big child advocate. I needed her to understand where together we needed to get over funding for our community practitioners. And so I would join arms with members on both sides of the aisle. It's too bad that more of that isn't going on now. It is as bad now as it could ever be, I hope. If it gets any worse than this, I can't imagine it. I left there at the end of 2008. I work in D.C. I still monitor our legislation on the Hill. For the last 2 years, and this astonishes me, we've been zeroed out in the president's budget for funding. You know, our funding, we obtained the funding, we had to have a federal partner. Justice is our natural federal partner. We went to Justice and we said, we would like you to umbrella the money that we appropriate over here. I eventually went to the Appropriations Committee. I went to the subcommittee that Commerce, Justice, State, that would fund our issues. Of course, I had some NASA issues back home that were funded under that budget as well. So that was a nice place for me to eventually get, so that I could monitor what kind of funding goes through Justice back to the field. And so I was Justice's partner in the legislative arena, and our Children's Center partner in the legislative arena as well. We had support from every president and every president's budget until last year, when this administration, astonishingly, zeroed us out of the budget. Well, we hit the Hill. I hit the Hill. I know the staff that still write the legislation. I know the members. My senior senator, Richard Shelby, who's ranking member on the full Senate Appropriations Committee, happens to be a Republican. We happen to have worked very, very well together over most issues, occasionally separating on some of the issues. But when it came to Alabama, we were together. And so he saw that this was Bud's plan, and that on the Senate side, they needed to do what we were doing on the House side as well. So Senator Shelby, I went to his office when we were zeroed out last year, covered the staff. We got the money back in the budget. Eric Holder, Attorney General, he and I dedicated a finally fine brand new facility for the D.C. Children's Advocacy Center, Safe Shores. We were there to dedicate it. We spoke. His background with child abuse issues is enormous. His support for our Children's Advocacy Centers had been enormous. He told me we made a mistake. We shouldn't have zeroed out funding for the Victims of Child Abuse Act is what the vision of the legislation is. But then lo and behold, this year it was zeroed out. So we've got some hard questions to ask, which some of the senators are asking Eric Holder in the hearing process. We don't want to go to war with justice, but we just want to understand how we wound up there. Again, I went back to the Hill, covering the Senate, covering the House, covering the staffs at the office to make sure that money is restored. And I still believe it will be restored. This is Another complicated budget year, to say the least. Sequestration hangs in the air. Continuing resolution, CR, that was postponed this week. It was supposed to be signed this week. That would continue budgets at last year's level, which would be good for us because we were in last year's budget. Still, the Senate mark, the House mark, puts our funding back in the budget as well. You don't get an awful lot of money from that as individual programs. Some of your state chapters do get significant money. Our national network, now known as the National Children's Alliance, they get significant amount of monies to exist. It's kind of a big principle of the thing budget mark for us in that we don't need to lose that funding. But just about every week I cover some angle of coverage there. I'm a lawyer in Washington. I've held a few interesting jobs in my life. I couldn't be prouder of the work that you do. I am amazed at how far we've come together. Thank you for having me, Stacy, as part of this program here. You've done for 13 years marvelous work up here. Chris and I have known that. Chris, I thank you for what you do down there in Huntsville. It's not easy running a program like that. I tend to, from time to time, refer to myself as the father of some of these centers. It's kind of approaching a time where I'm feeling like the grandfather of some of these centers, especially when I look out on an audience as young as this audience is. But you inspire me. I want to help you. I want to support you. I want you to work in the context of the history of how we came about. I can tell from your body language your struggles are still some of the same that we had. We want to make sure these programs continue to thrive. That communities that don't have the programs get the opportunity to put their programs together, and we'll keep working together to cause that to happen. Thank you for having me.